With just a few fabricated parts and a parts store rack and pinion, you too can add rack and pinion steering to an early 60s Galaxie. Greetings, fellow DIYer, and welcome to another episode of I Didn't Shoot Any Video for That. Back in 2015, long before I had a YouTube channel, I did a project where I installed a GM J-Car rack in my 62 Galaxie. The nice thing about the GM J-Car rack is it is center steer. What makes that such an advantage is having the takeoff points for the rack and pinion be center easily allows you to install bracketry to emulate the original steering of the classic car you're trying to retrofit the rack and pinion to. These racks have been put in all kinds of things, from Mustangs to Galaxies and other makes models. It is a very common swap. The first step in the process is to start with the rack and pinion. You can find these at a junkyard, or you can go to your auto parts store and buy one. GMJ cars were produced from 1981 to 2005 in various models. Most notably would be the Cavalier, but there are a lot of other models that fall into that J-car family. The second step in the process was to carefully analyze the steering on the car that I was retrofitting the rack to. The important part here is that we emulate the original steering geometry. In other words, we want it to act the same way that the original steering did from a suspension standpoint. By taking a lot of measurements and noting things like tie rod length and tie rod connection points, I was able to draw up the measurements for the original Galaxie steering. And then I removed all those components from the car. As with most things in my life, I went at this project in a slightly different direction than I think a lot of people would. Because I was emulating the Galaxie steering, I wanted to start with the center position and work my way out. I knew approximately where the J-Car rack needed to sit to line everything up with the frame rails. But I also knew that I would be fabricating brackets on either end. So if the J-Car rack moved a little to the right or a little to the left, that could easily be taken up with those brackets. To that end, I began the process by creating the bracketry that goes in the middle of the J-Car rack and results in the same measurements for the center takeoff points for the Galaxie steering. This resulted in a bracket that was slightly offset and that was an angle that was a little larger than 90 degrees. I also had to add standoffs so that the bracket cleared everything in the rack and pinion and gave ample room for the new steering linkage. And then once I had it to its rough shape, I began the process of gusseting. I am by no means an engineer, but I do subscribe to the technique of use experience to come up with a basic thickness and design, and then make it twice as strong, make it 3 times as strong, basically throw some steel at it. So I added several gussets, and then I welded on a plate over the top of 2 of them, not so much for strength, but to keep out moisture, and drilled 2 holes in the main bracket so that any water that got in there would have a drain point. The next phase in my quest to emulate the Galaxie steering was to copy the original Galaxie tie rod arms. Now, I could have used the original tie rod arms and used a reamer to have the tie rod taper fit into the bracket I made. But for simplicity's sake, I decided to go with heim joints on the rack and pinion bracket end. So basically this linkage is just tubing designed for steering linkage with threading in both ends, left and right hand, just like normal tie rod linkage. And then I have a heim joint on one end and the original Galaxie tie rod on the other end. At the rack and pinion bracket end, I also added a second piece of steel to put the bolts that hold the heim joints in place into double shear. This significantly strengthens this setup and helps reduce the risk of shearing off one of the bolts that is holding the heim joint to the rack and pinion bracket. From there, I mocked it up in the car by attaching the tie rod ends to the steering arms on the spindles, connecting it to the bracket, connecting the bracket to the rack and pinion, and then using a transmission jack to hold it all in place. This put the rack in the correct position so that I could begin taking measurements and doing the work to fabricate the mounting brackets for the actual rack and pinion. As with most DIY projects like this, there was a lot of test fitting. If you look in this picture, you can see that it was an early form of the center bracket, that the gussets hadn't been put in place and that a lot of the parts had not been welded together yet. But it was functionally the same bracket that I ended up with when it was all welded together. This was just a specific mock-up to get everything located exactly where it needed to be. With everything in the correct location, I began making the driver's side bracket. I wanted to use the original steering box mounting holes. Also, I wanted to use the mounting holes for the original power steering ram. Because of where these holes lined up and where the rack and pinion needed to be, I actually had to split the standoff coming off the bracket so that I had access to one of the original mounting holes. I could have drilled new holes and used them to mount things up, but I'm always for making it as easy as possible to return to the original setup should something not work correctly. So with holes existing that were already threaded and ready to go, there was no reason for me to create new holes. I just had to design my brackets to work with what was already there. The passenger side was a whole lot simpler, just basically a piece of angle iron that bolts into the original steering linkage mounting location and then bridges the gap to attach to the other end of the rack and pinion. The driver's side bracket ends up resting on the underside of the frame rail, so it did not need any strengthening. But the passenger side bracket does float out away from the passenger side frame rail. So I added a large gusset to the center of that to help create rigidity. Both of these brackets are made of 1/4-inch angle iron. With the rack and pinion now sitting in its new home, I turned my attention to connecting said rack and pinion to the steering wheel. I have a double U-joint at the rack and pinion end and a single U-joint at the steering column end. This required me to support the steering shaft that connects the two. And for best results, you need to support it right next to the double U-joint. I tried several bracket configurations to help support this, and then I did what I call a dry test. With the engine off, no power steering assist, I turned the steering wheel and looked to see if there was flex in my bracket. I had to make several different revisions to my bracket, including welding on this standoff piece to make it rigid enough that it would not flex when the steering is turned in a worst case scenario situation, where you have lost power assist and are having to do everything manually. I was able to buy one power steering hose specific for the car that my rack and pinion came from. And I cut each end off to be the in and the out on the power steering. Thankfully, the fittings fit perfectly so that I had my high pressure and low pressure end. I flared the end of the steel tubing and used an inverted flare connector to connect it to my power steering lines. Originally, when I set this up, I used a Ford type power steering pump, and it worked fine. However, the Ford power steering pump was kind of noisy. I later upgraded to a GM Type 2 power steering pump, which is the kind of pump that you would normally see on a GM J car, and the noise went away. I didn't notice any difference between the two pumps as far as functionality. The GM Type 2 pump was just a lot quieter and a whole lot smaller. After all the fabrication was done, the parts went to the powder coater so that they could be coated and get ready for final install. I would like to note, if you look on the tie rod connecting tube, there is 1-inch square tubing welded to said tube. I did this so that a person could easily take a 1-inch box wrench and turn said tube when making alignment adjustments. With all the parts ready to go, I installed the rack for the final time. Everything bolted in place just as it should. I was able to do a basic alignment on it and get the toe set correctly and take it out for a test drive. I am extremely happy with the results. This car drives way better than it ever used to. I can go down the road and let go of the steering wheel and it tracks straight. I can move the steering wheel a little to the left, we go to the left. I move the steering wheel a little to the right, we go to the right. With the original steering, it was so sloppy and so worn out that I could move the steering wheel 3-4 inches before the car would begin to track in the direction that I had moved it. The only downside to going with the GM J-Car rack is that I have lost some turning radius. So that means in a tight turning situation like parking, I may have to jockey a little bit to get into the spot. But for me, that is a small price to pay to be able to have such an enjoyable driving experience when I'm going down the road. If you like what you've seen, please click like. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.